We're a band called Amber Run, and we're here with NOISIV, and these are the top 5 albums that have made us who we are today.
There's an album by a band called This Will Destroy You. They're a band from Texas in the US, and it's a self-titled album. But I remember specifically when I first heard the album, at the time I was listening to all this metal, and that was pretty much all I listened to, was just like metal bands. And
we went to school together, and literally like he had this like long ringlety hair, and it was awful.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, I remember listening to or hearing one of these songs. It was on someone's like MySpace page or something like that, and I just remember hearing one of these songs, and it was genuinely one of those moments when you hear the song, and it's like, up to that point I'd only listened to metal, and then I heard this one song by them. It's called Three-Legged Workhorse on the album, which is like the opener song, and I just remember that was like the last time I ever listened to metal, and it's like from then on it literally was like shift my perspective on music completely, and it was like I after listening to the album, what I wanted to get out of music was completely different to what I wanted before. So it was like it's instrumental, the whole thing, and it's this kind of cinematic, soundtracky almost music, and it made me really appreciate like the power of melody and the music and the kind of arrangement of songs away from vocals and lyrics, and how, you know, music doesn't have to have lyrics or vocals to make you feel something. And you know, it's such a sort of spacious record, and there's so much atmosphere to it. It just kind of shifted everything, especially with guitar playing as well for me. Like, I stopped trying to play metal riffs and started, you know, experimenting with making soundscapes, which is essentially like what really excites me.
And he brought, I remember it was actually Will that first played me This Will Destroy You, which is obviously a big part of what we do as well, because we try and create these kind of big, you know, reverby soundscapes. And he played me a song called Burial on the Presidio Banks, and it's honestly just one of the most beautiful pieces of music. Like, you know, we all listen to a lot of pop, and like the radio plays and churns out a lot of pop that we've all heard 1,000 times before, but a lot like Will, listening to this song for the first time, it was just such a moment of, this is what music is as well. And it was just so exciting. There's no like lyrics or you know, someone kind of shouting their feelings at you. It's literally just beautiful music. And it was, yeah, a real moment for me listening to stuff like that. Again, a lot like Will, because it just kind of changes your perspective of what's important when you do listen to music.
I think we'll go with Kid A by Radiohead. My reasoning being, I think it's just cool. Like, well, my favourite thing about it is more the context, because I think that what Radiohead did with that album, nobody could do ever again, because of the nature of the music industry these days, with like reliance on streaming and radio and stuff. The fact that they, as a band, could come out with something like OK Computer, which was like, you know, a huge album, a seminal album, and like they're kind of at the top of their game, and for them to then go off and say, actually, I don't want to, like, we're not going to play our instruments anymore, we're going to go completely left field, experimental, do something that like nobody expected, that, you know, admittedly is in a lot of cases, like when you're listening to like free jazz and stuff on the national anthem, like it's hard to get into, it's not accessible music, and yet it's their first #1 in the USA. And it's like the fact that they were able to, like, at the peak of their, well, not even the peak, at, you know, just
Once at the top of their game.
Yeah, but like, you know, when they could have done another OK Computer and written more, you know, anthems, they decided to go the completely other direction. And still,
for artists, like, as well, because, you know, these guys went and started playing different instruments. They didn't go in and just play their standard stuff. That's super inspiring. That you can still write an album that can get to #1, because what's exciting about music, and what we've always found exciting, is when you do something in a slightly different way from how you normally do it. The actual writing process, the recording process, becomes so much more fun, so much more inspiring than it ever has before. And when the band are having fun, and when they're genuinely inspired, the music is just always so much better, because you can kind of feel the excitement in the record.
Definitely. And it's just, I think it's something that we, especially on this next album, possibly might take into into account is trying to do something that people don't really expect so much. You know, you don't want to fall into doing the same thing over and over again. And I think that's why Radiohead are considered like the best band of the last 20 or 30 years, is because they've done everything. They've done radio hits, they've done like experimental, they've done emotional, they've done angry, and it's like have every base covered. And it's like, you know, that's the kind of thing you aspire to, not just being a one-trick pony.
And I think Kid A is a really great example of that. I still think there's some amazing songwriting on there, but there's also some really innovative, interesting songs. So yeah, Kid A is number 2. Yes, there was a slight disagreement here about which Bon Iver album we'd go for number 3. I really love 22 A Million, the last one.
I love the second one, Bon Iver.
So I think it's a dead heat, but we should talk about Bon Iver, because I love that one as well.
Yeah, I remember the reason why I love that one is because I remember it was like when I first heard his first album. You know, there's the whole like story that gets bandied around about him about, you know, he broke up with his girlfriend, his band split up, locked himself in a cabin in the woods and wrote this like amazingly tender album. And like so many people loved that first album, but it was that second one where I thought like he fully like I think he would have had a lot of expectation in a similar way to Radiohead, in that he'd done something very, very well on the first album, like, you know, kind of folky singer-songwriter thing, and he then comes out with another album that is better, and it is like, you know, a step forward. And in the same way, that's why I think 22 Million is also like a credit to him as a musician, because it's like every album is different. It's not like Bon Iver has a sound. Like that's one thing I hate about music, is when somebody is lazy about defining what a band is. Like, you know, a band this like a folky band, or they play rock music, play indie, and they sound like this, because all the best bands don't sound like one thing. It's like Bon Iver is not a folk band because he has 2 albums that don't have folk moments on them at all. Like the last album is barely folk. I mean, there's no acoustic guitars on it. Just the idea that you're able to go off and do something incredible and then improve on it again and improve on it again, and it's the same. Yeah, like it's the same kind of vibe with Kid A.
I'd even say just as much we love that This Will Destroy You stuff we said to begin with, that Bon Iver's second album, the soundscapes he creates, the kind of instrumentation that he uses, creates this just amazing bed for a guy that obviously has unbelievable melody and can write an amazing song. But just the production on what he does is so interesting and really innovative. And we're in an age where people rely quite heavily on production and making their own kind of synth beds, or like, and everything. You know, often a lot of stuff sounds really similar, but what Bon Iver did on that second record is create amazing instrumental beds for really lovely melody, and he did it in a really interesting way, using instruments that you don't hear in mainstream pop and stuff, and I just
pedal
think it's
steel.
yeah. And because pedal steel, for me, I just think country, and it just sounds well naff. But you when people use these like beautiful instruments in a way that is, beautiful, rather than kind of just a nod to the fact that you can play it.
Yeah. Also, that album has like massive nostalgic value for me, because it came out when we were in our last year of school, and it was like the summer. So I remember that album came out on my last exam at school, and like I finished my exam, went home and listened to that album. And it was like that summer before we all of us and our friends went off to university, and just like a really, really nice time. And I remember as well, like, that was my album, the only album I had in my car when I'd go driving, like when I just passed my driving test. So I'd just spend my time driving around listening to the album. So it's just proper nostalgic moment.
I remember we finished our exams at the end of school, and we were having like a fire. Like, we're just sitting around a fire at Will's now girlfriend's house, listening to Perth, so that reminds me of that song, reminds me of that moment, and then within like 10 minutes of that, we're all jumping in this girl's pool as well. And it was just, when you have albums that take you back to that exact moment, there's real currency to that. And it's a beautiful album, and that's why it's number 3. Number 3. Number 4, is an album called Trouble Will Find Me by The National, which, you know, we've said it's number 4, but in all honesty is probably my number 1.
I think these are in no particular order, personally.
Okay, cool. All right, good.
They're just great albums that we love.
Because if The National ever listen to this, I need to make sure they know that they're number 1.
Yeah, I couldn't put...
There's just a couple of tunes on that album that generally just mean the world to me. You know, well, when lyrically, for me, a band like The National are just best of the best. Because for a long time, I always felt that music was an opportunity to get a festival crowd moving. It was an opportunity to try and, you know, just... You're never allowed to talk about sad things. Especially, I don't know about anyone else, but for me, that was definitely the case. And then I started listening to The National, and I realised that you can make beautiful music, you can make engaging music, and you can draw from stuff other than, you know, like booties in the club.
I think they're an inspiring band for us, particularly because they're not, in the UK at least, they're not a band that you'd hear on the radio, and we're also not a band you hear on the radio. And it's this idea that, and you know, they were 4 or 5 albums in or something before they started like getting big, and it's this, you know, being in a band that when things don't go your way, it's difficult to convince yourself to carry on. So on one hand, there's that personal level of like, these guys must have struggled for a few years, but they kind of stuck with it.
Super inspiring.
Yeah, and it's also this idea of, a bit like Joe says, like these guys are a huge band, and like when they play in America, they play to thousands and thousands of people, and you know, they play Glastonbury this weekend, and they were the one before headliner on the main stage. They don't write, like Joe says, they don't write hooky music, they don't write songs like radio hits that have catchy melodies.
They write
like,
music for music's sake.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are so few bands that do that anymore, you know.
Yeah, and
it's so easy to fall into the trap of, I'd like to make some money, I'd like the girls in the front row to know my name. And maybe they want that, but at the same time,
it's
you know,
easy.
It's not that to us.
It's easy to sit there when you're writing music and try and... it's easy to say, let's just write something facile and menial and like meaningless that everyone can sing back, and it's only 3 words. And like in a lot of ways, that is great, and we've done that. Exactly. Yeah. We've done that, and it's great fun to play live, but it's like, as a musician, you aspire to something more, definitely. You aspire to, like, you know, be able to have some sort of critical acclaim and grow as musicians. You don't... That's the thing with us, we're only 2 albums in, and we look at guys like The National and Elbow and Radiohead as well, for example, as bands who... Like, these days, it's so hard to think of a good band who's going to have a long career, who's had a number 1 on their first album, because... where do you go from having a number 1? Where do you go from having radio hits on everything? And it's kind of like, if you're in that position, you probably feel the pressure to like keep doing that. Whereas these bands have never felt that pressure, so therefore they're able to grow. And that's something I think we aspire to, is to get better on every album. Like, never saying that like our last album was the best one we've done. In the same way, The National get better every time and continue to grow, which is why that's number 4.
The Suburbs by Arcade Fire. You know, for a long time, I didn't, you know, I'll put my hands up and say I didn't get the Arcade Fire.
Arcade
thing.
Fire.
Arcade Fire thing.
Oh, the Arcade Fire.
Yeah. The Arcade Fire.
I didn't
thing.
understand the Arcade Fires.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, the Arcade Fires. The Arctic Monkeys. Awful. You know, and you know, I might have been in that moment where I was like, you listen to what your mates listen to, and you think what's on the mainstream media is great, and you know, everything's great, everything's fantastic, but The Suburbs to me is just an unbelievable album. I think some of the stuff they're saying is so poignant. You know, it's real, like really, like real social commentary. Like Sprawl 2 for me is just such an interesting concept they're talking about these, like, you know, mountains beyond mountains, and these, you know, like shopping malls being everywhere, and like in reality, because your phone and the internet, you're never truly going to be alone, and you can't escape everything. So again, a lot like we're talking about The National, these guys really touch on some issues that I think that I personally feel, and I think they do it in a really like engaging way. And I don't think like he's the most proficient singer in the world, but there's so much character to what they do, and I think that's something that's lost slightly now as well in this moment of like unbelievably solid, beautiful production. And like for us, we have in England, we have a thing called like Britain's Got Talent and the X Factor, and it's all about like how good they are at singing, and when in reality
they're not even that good most of the time as well.
Yeah, but in reality, what you get from a band is the character, like the things that they push forward, and that's what Arcade Fire are to me. And I think the Suburbs is an amazing album.
I think you can see a sort of I'm trying to think what the word is. There's definitely a relationship between most of these albums that we've listed. Is that Radiohead, The National, Arcade Fire, like they're all big bands who have done a lot of albums but have never really had radio hits, which is kind of what we want. It's like I think obviously it's great to have a radio hit. It would be fantastic and it would make change your life and everything. But I also think that some people can become obsessed by that being the be all end all when actually these bands are exemplifying that you can. Like making good music should be the main thing. Like radio can go and it's irrelevant. What you want to be doing is making good music, and that's just what they do. And they're the biggest bands in the world because they're the best bands in the world.
Yeah, and we, personally for Amber Run, we aspire to be like these guys because they just write the music they want to write, and they get to tour for years and years and years, and they got to where they are by looking people in the eye at a show. And believing what they're singing, what they're playing, and I could probably count on one hand the amount of bands that are able to do that nowadays. So I think they're a beautiful thing to aspire to. These bands that we've been talking about. I really hope that you like the music that we like. We're touring in Germany on the 1st to the 5th of November, and it'll be a pleasure to see you. And we can talk about music then as well.